uh, s- and it's a great pleasure to connect with the juniors and the teachers and all the fraternities who are currently in this webinar. Actually, I've been trying to connect with our juniors for a very long time, but couldn't able to do so because I am currently staying outside India. So, without any further delay, I would like to start today's agenda, and I will share my screen so that everybody can see my screen. Is my screen is everybody can see my screen, right?
Yes, it's visible. Yes.
Yes, it's visible.
Right. So today's presentation and the concepts we will be talking about is the introduction to organizational greenhouse gas accounting. This comes under the ISO 1464 family. So I hope everyone, or at least some of you, are aware of the ISO standards. So ISO is a governing body. ISO is ISO is a governing body where it defines standards on various sectors, and one of them, the sectors that you will be having, is also on the greenhouse gas. Now, I believe in the last webinar, there has been a discussion, or the webinar was presented on the particularly on the carbon credits. Now, all the these topics which you are currently working on, or you are currently talking about, like carbon credits, ESG, decarbonization, energy efficiency, it directly or indirectly comes out of, like, it's a derivative. The mother of everything is this ISO 1464 standards, because based on that, the framework has been developed on the other standards as well. So it's very important to understand what is exactly ISO 1464 standards and how you are going to go about and report those requirements.
Everybody is. Am I? I am not able to listen any voice. Is it my problem, or everybody is listening to what Sovik is telling?
Yes, I can. Yeah, yeah.
So you need to dial in. So you need to dial in. Then only you can listen.
Hello.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay, I think sir is not audible. So please confirm him, like, he is having some issues, maybe. All right. So we can move ahead with our next slide. So yes, as we were speaking about that, what exactly is ISO 1464? So ISO 1464 exists as a guide for the private and public sector for developing the GHG inventories for their organization, as well as the foundation for policymakers and program developers for initiative to address the global environmental challenge on climate change. Now, this development of ISO 1464, in addition to ISO 14000 environmental standard, which is very popular, I think even in your batch, you have environment management students as well, who are particularly well versed with this ISO 14000 standard. So they begin the development of both these standards, ISO 1464 and ISO 14000, started in the year 2002. Now, what was the objective behind this, the development of this standard? Is to create a technically rigorous but a policy neutral product. Regardless a country's current climate change policies, especially its participation in the United Nations Kyoto Protocol. So as everybody understands, like, and currently you have it in your syllabus as well, that how the development of the Kyoto Protocol happened, and over the years, how the development of CDM and joint implementations and the other various registries came into the picture. So ISO 1464 provided the initial framework, but it is a policy neutral product. So what do you mean by the policy neutral product? It means that it is not specific concerned towards a particular mechanism or registry. Like, it doesn't directs you that, okay, this standard specifically concentrates on the CDM or joint implementation or any other programs, like you have VCS, you have gold standard, you have Global Carbon Council. So these are the various products. Now there are social carbon, these are the topics. So it is unbiased towards any of these program registry. It talks about how you are going to measure, capture your greenhouse gas emissions from your organizations, which can be your direct and indirect emissions. So this is very important, particularly for most of you who are starting their career in some of the big corporates and are going to start the career, to guide the organization on how you are going to report your greenhouse gas emissions. Now, after I complete this presentation, I can discuss about what is the current trend in the market, so that you can prepare yourself accordingly, and which will give you a good platform of getting a good breakthrough in any organization in terms of job profile. So now ISO 1464 has got 3 parts. As you can see in the slide, the part 1 of the standard is titled as the specification with guidance at the organization level for quantification and reporting of greenhouse gas and removals. This part of the standards particularly addresses how to conduct the greenhouse gas emission inventories of organization, such as any corporates or any MNCs, using a bottom-up approach. So I will discuss more in details what do we mean by this bottom-up approach, like from how we are going about data collection, consolidation, and then finally on the emission quantification. Part 2 of the standard talks about the how to address the quantification and reporting of the emission reductions from project activities. This is the most important thing in the entire ISO 1464 as far as you are concerned, because you in your day-to-day life will be capturing and identifying the emission reductions, and then you need to report it in a particular template. Part 3 of the standards is particularly relevant for the industries or the organizations who wanted to get the reports which are filled in part 2 to be verified by any third party, particularly any auditing firm who have the accreditation of carrying out the validation or the verification. So they verify your claims and reports, and then they issue a verification statement, including that what is whether the claim that you are making on the emission reductions and the emissions from the organization, both direct and indirect, are actually genuine or not. So this is subjected, it's a voluntary steps. Some organizations, big organizations, they actually go and carry out this part 3, but it is not mandatory. But for every organization, part 1 and part 2 is definitely a mandatory requirement. So that's what you need to currently focus on and need to learn about that. Now, so as we go along, as I told you, the applications of ISO 1460 family. So various applications are there. It depends on how effective you are carrying it out. Like, these based on the ISO 1464 applications, you can make a good amount of corporate decisions, which actually helps the company to improve its profit margin. So usually when we are working in any manufacturing, the profit is directly related to the sales of its products. But for any energy management division, which is in any corporate, you generate profit by improving its bottom line. When I talk about the bottom line, is that you generally you help to improve your company's profit margin by improving certain things, like particularly having energy efficiency, conducting energy audits, and which will help the company to reduce its per capita consumption. So this in indirectly helps the company to improve its bottom line, which we call the profit margin. Next, there is voluntary initiatives that we were talking about, like carbon offset and carbon credits projects. I think this you have already have an idea, good amount of idea in your earlier webinar. And then the risks and opportunity. So this ISO 1464, with the application of ISO 1464, you can actually help to minimize the risk and opportunity on any organization. Currently, if you are aware, the topics like ESG, environmental, social, and governance, these are catching up in a very fast rate in all the organizations, where company try to assess their risks and opportunities with related to the process or the products that they deliver, so that how their products or processes are impacting the stakeholders directly or indirectly. Then you have the fourth benefit, which is the regulatory and government GHG programs. In European Union, if you go to Europe, there are mandates, a lot of cap and trade programs are there, where every organizations have given a certain limit to, beyond which they cannot emit their GHG emissions. If they are emitting it, then they have to buy the equivalent carbon credits from the companies who have actually performed better than them. So similar to Europe, there are certain programs which are also applicable in India, like PAT scheme is there, perform, achieve, and trade. So those who are not yet aware of the PAT scheme, please go through that. Even though if it is in today's world, how in today's year, I am not sure how much active the PAT scheme is, but definitely it's a good read if you go through that. And then the overall GHG markets, which again, I talk about various programs and registries are there, like CDM, joint implementation, then gold standard or VCS Vera. In Middle East, you have GCC, Global Carbon Council. So accordingly, this ISO 1464 also helps you to define how to get into that as well. So just a minute. Yeah. So here I have tried to give you a pictorial and a diagram of the link between the three parts, which is ISO 1464 1, 2, and then you have ISO 1467, which is mainly not relevant in our discussion in today's webinar. If you see at the bottom how ISO 1464 part 3 is supporting in each of these categories for the verification and validation of greenhouse gas statement. So this is basically, you can say, a mapping where you can understand how the flow of the ISO 1464 happens. So here you can have a good understanding of that. Now coming back, what is corporate GHG accounting? Now, corporate carbon accounting or a greenhouse gas accounting is the process of quantifying the amount of greenhouse gas which are produced directly and indirectly from the business or any activities of the organization within a set of boundaries. Emissions are broken down into scope 1, 2, and 3. So I'm not sure if you are aware of scope 1, 2, and 3. We will be discussing that in brief as well in this seminar to give you an idea that what are the emissions are categorized into, first of all, into direct and indirect emissions. And then they are further categorized into scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions as well. There is something called scope 4 emissions, which are currently also being very much talk of the town. But generally people are or the organizations currently are focusing only on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Now, what are scope 1 emissions? These are actually encompasses the direct emissions from the owned or the control sources like company vehicles, manufacturing facilities, or etc. Which means that any scope 1 emissions where the emissions are directly generated by any organizations, these are categorized as a scope 1 emissions. For example, if you have if you are working in a power plant, thermal power plant, so the coal that is being used to generate the electricity and the emissions that you are getting from the burning of the coal, or for that any matter, natural gas, any fossil fuel, and you are having the emissions from there, it is categorized into a scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions and scope 3, these are indirect emissions. Scope 2 emissions, particularly, we generally talk about which are the indirect emissions that are generated from the purchased electricity or steam or heat or cooling, which is mostly the common case, like any industry or any corporates. If you are working even in consulting firm or even in any corporates, if you are purchasing electricity from the grid, so that you need to take it into account in scope 2 emissions. Now, next is scope 3 emissions. Here it becomes a bit tricky because of its complexities and the availability of the data. And as it says, scope 3 is a very broad category that include all other types of indirect emissions. So in a simpler terms, I would say, like, for examples, if you have if you are working in a manufacturing industry, so the emissions that you have from cradle to gate, or from cradle to grave, that I would say, there are a lot of indirect emissions that happens in it. And also there are some of the fugitive emissions as well that you would encounter. These are a part of, or you can report it, the scope 3 emissions as well. So I think this is a very common diagram everybody has come across in various, textbooks, or if you are following keenly on LinkedIn or any internet. So how the scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3 emissions are interrelated and how it is being captured. One interesting point I would like to highlight here, that ISO 1464 talks about greenhouse gas. Whereas if you talk about particularly any GHG programs like CDM, joint implementation, they only talk about one of the greenhouse gas, which is CO2. But here we don't not only talk about CO2, we take into account all the greenhouse gas that is covered as per the UNFCCC. So that thing you have to keep it in mind while you are calculating your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, that it is not only about how much CO2 is emitting from any organization or process. You need to take into account the other greenhouse gas as well. So if you see the greenhouse gas, what I was talking about, everybody of us know as on date, like, there are almost mainly six greenhouse gas that we talk about: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, nitrogen trifluoride, hexafluoride, SF6, and other hydrocarbons, which are HFC, PFC, So the last one you will particularly found in any cooling industries, like if you are working in any AC manufacturing or chiller manufacturing companies. So you will mainly find this type of refrigerants. They carry the particularly this type of emissions. SF6 are mainly find you can found during in the grid or the in the transformer losses as well, and also in some of the petrochemicals. So like that, you need to be aware what are the relevant GHG gases that you are currently working in the sector. What are the relevant GHG gases in those sectors as well. So if you if I summarize this, how the GHG accounting works. So there are 4 steps. First, you have to set the boundaries. Anything and any work that we do, we need to first to understand and identify what are the boundaries. Even for that matter, if you are doing the energy audit, it's very important to set the boundaries on exactly what is your boundary, so that you can understand what is your input energy and what is your output energy. Only then you can identify, okay, what is my efficiency loss, or what is the actual efficiency of that particular asset or that particular product that I'm dealing with. So same thing here, we need to set the boundaries, which we have to select the activities, emissions to measure according to the legal structures and desired outcomes. Now, once you set the boundaries, then it becomes easier for you to collect the data. So second step becomes as a collection of the data. Now, the collection of the data is that you need to typically we generally collect the historic data like the electricity bills, natural gas consumption, coal consumption, or if any company is using diesel, what is the diesel consumption? Generally, we take last 3 years records, so that in order to remove any outliers, uh, or if last 3 years records are not available, then 12 months data for sure we need it to understand and to get a good understanding of the trend, that how the consumption and the emissions has happened over the last year. Now, then definitely you will go ahead and calculate what are your emissions based on the available informations. For that, you need to identify the, as I mentioned, different gases have their different GWP. And so you need to identify the global warming potentials of those gases, and accordingly select the emission factors which are valid and relevant for those particular gases as well. And then finally, you do the verification and reporting. So these steps are generally done internally. If you have, the company has a good resources, or if you are working and you are confident, so you can do the reporting. Or in case people generally take help of the external consultants or any consulting companies, they also do such type of services as well. So yeah, as I was mentioned about, before we were talking about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, I talked about, like, broadly we categorized into direct and indirect GHG emissions. So these are the different types of emissions that you are, it should be documented, it should be categorized and documented at the facility level, which is very important. So you need to identify what are your direct and indirect emissions first, and then you need to go further deep and categorize them into as scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. So just to give you a brief understanding of category 1, what are direct GHG emissions? So direct GHG emissions and removals occur from GHG sources or sinks that are inside organizational boundaries and that are owned or controlled by the organizations. Some of the examples are like heaters or any sort of stationary combustion. For example, if you can say, mainly we have boilers, heaters, electricity generators, industrial process, but it can be mobile as well, like for the vehicles as well. Indirect GHG emissions are the GHG emissions which are happen due to the fuel consumption associated with the final energy and utility, such as I told you, purchase of electricity, heat, steam, cooling, on the compressed air. But we don't generally include any upstream emissions. For example, if you are working in any power plant, so the extraction of the coal from the coal mines till the power plant gate, we generally don't take that into account. Or if you are working in any oil and gas sectors, so the upstream emissions are not a part of this category. So it is very important, again, as I told you, to define your boundary. Otherwise, you end up, reporting on a higher emission level or on an under emissions level, which can be very detrimental for any organization. Category 3, GHG emissions from the transportations. So GHG emissions, which generally occurs, from the sources which are outside the organizational boundaries. These boundaries, what I would say, is generally mobile and mostly, uh, due to the fuel used due to the public transport, which are used in the process. For example, you are delivering the finished products to the vendors or the customers, so you are using through various fleets. It could be trucks, it could be sea. So the emissions that are happening from those transportations are coming in the category 3, which are indirect GHG emissions. A few more examples, if I am going about, category 4. Also, we have an indirect GHG emissions from the products used by the organization. So this is typically a life cycle approach emissions, as I would say. So once you have the finished product and it is being used by any end users, so over the time it will have some emissions, right? For example, if I tell you in layman terms, everybody of us having most of us are having like split AC or window AC in our home. And during the summer, if the AC is if it is malfunctioned, or if it if it goes for overhauling, we generally do the top up of the gas, which is R410A. So these are the emissions, but that generally happens through this AC over the period of its usage, are categorized under indirect emissions category 4. So there is very subtle difference, but yes, once you start working on it, you would be able to understand what are the thin line of margin between category 3 and category 4 emissions on that part. There is some category 5 emissions as well. I have mentioned it, but as of now, I don't think that it is that much relevant for you, because very few organizations, almost null, are currently goes that much deeper in these aspects. But yes, you can take a note of it for your study as well. It will be helpful. Now, I told you earlier that we need to define boundaries. Now, in organizational context, the boundaries are generally two types. One is the control approach, the boundaries that you define using a control approach, and the other one is equity share approach. Just to make you understand in the very simple terms, control approach, generally we choose whenever an organization accounts for the 100% of its operations on the particular process. Then we go ahead and choose this controlled approach. Equity share approach is generally adopted by organization where it has 100% of its money invested in particular plant, or let's say any industry. For example, let's say if Tesla is investing 100% of its shares, or 100% of his investment is done in any local based startup in India. So there it will Tesla will have to consider equity share approach while reporting its greenhouse gas emissions. So this is again a very interesting thing you need to understand, because as per the ISO 1464 guidelines and mandate, you need to clearly mention what is the type of organizational boundaries you are considering, whether it is a controlled approach or whether it is a equity share approach. One of the most important thing is the base year. So I will keep often giving you an example of energy audits or for example CDM projects also. Everybody, we consider a baseline year, right? We define a baseline. So baseline, what is a baseline? The baseline is typically comes from this terminology, which is a base year GHG inventory. So we generally define a base year during which an organization production or process or the output remains fairly constant and which can be a representative, because based on the baseline year we would be able to identify how much emission reductions or how much reductions in the energy consumptions we are going to achieve over the next 3 years, I would say. And then probably you can again change your baseline year. Now, baseline year can be static as well as dynamic as well. So although this is not mentioned in this slide, I would like to highlight here that static baseline doesn't changes over the time. So it remains fixed. So for example, if you consider 2012 as a baseline year, so it remains fixed for the next 10 years. If you are doing any CDM projects, you would see the project developers, they mention a baseline year, they calculate the emissions based on say 2022, and then when they calculate the emission reductions for the next 10 years, they don't change the baseline. That is an example of a static baseline. Now in organization context, when we are doing an energy audits or any sort of a greenhouse gas reduction program, we generally set a baseline, let's say 2022. And then for there, we set a target that, okay, for next 3 years, I will be reducing my emissions or my energy consumption, let's say 5% per annum for next 3 years. So when I successfully completed my 5% reductions at the end of the 3 years, I will set again a new benchmark or a new baseline. Based on that, I will again carry out the further program or further initiatives. That is called a dynamic baseline. So base year inventory selection is a very important step, and you have to particularly be very careful to identify what is the baseline year that you are quantifying. For example, if anyone has considered a baseline year as, I would say 2019, during which there is a pandemic, there was a pandemic and your operations was not 100%, that will not be a correct approach, because that is the organization has to work or was operating on its part load or even below the part load conditions because of the pandemic situation. So again, baseline year has to be something where there has not been any disruptions and the productions has been fairly constant, and there has not been any I would say any more independent variables impacts that has happened on that year. So that will be a good representative year. Mitigation activities. So we have selected the base year, we have selected the boundaries, we have identified the greenhouse gas emissions, and we have understand how much emissions we are currently doing, how much consumption we are currently doing. Next step is how we are going to reduce these emissions or consumptions, which comes under this category, which is called mitigation activities. So there are a lot of technologies or lot of opportunities which you can usually use when you are doing this mitigation activities. I'm not going through each and everything of it. Yes, the foremost and the most important part is the first two, which is energy demand and use management and energy efficiency. So you have to build your concepts and strengths very clear, in these two terminology and in these two technologies of energy audits and energy efficiencies. Because as you see the down, all the other, sorry, all the other aspects or all the other indicators are basically, I would say, a derivative of the first two. So GHG emission reductions or removal enhancements, yes, there are a lot of opportunities once you have done the mitigations, once you have carried out different strategies, like for examples, in boilers, you have used economizers, you have done the preheating, of fuels, so once you have achieved a certain standards and that this is the best that we can go through in improving the efficiency, and still there is a balance of emissions, right, that you cannot actually negate or you cannot offset. So how to go about that? There are various options like purchasing of REC certificate, VCS credits, clean air certificates, which especially in Middle East and GCC it is relevant. So organizations generally try to offset, and that's how they claim that they are carbon neutral. So you often hear these words: carbon neutral, net zero. So these are nothing but the combinations of your energy efficiency, energy reductions projects, and then offset the balance of it. So maybe in some other sections, in some other webinars, we can discuss in details on what is the difference between net zero and climate carbon neutral projects. So there are a lot of terminologies people don't know, but they keep on using, like carbon positive, carbon neutral, carbon negative, net zero. So everything has its own meaning and difference, and we need to be aware of that. So I would request everybody also to have a check and go through it and read it also sometime. It will be a good text to read as well. Yes, these are the things that I have actually summarized with you. The organization may set targets, as I told you, like based on first your base year, you set targets that how much emission reductions or energy consumption reduction you are going to achieve. It can be 5%, which 5% when we say it is generally an intensity, or generally people talk about, let's say, we would reduce our emission reductions, I would say, by 100 units per metric ton of product. So that is a type of target which is intensity based. Otherwise, you have an absolute based target where you would directly say that over the next 3 years, we are going to reduce 1 million emission reductions. We are going to have 1 million of emission reductions over the next 3 years. That it becomes your absolute target. So it depends upon your management approvals and your own organization to organization context. What is the type of target that you would like to achieve, whether it is intensity based targets or absolute based targets? I'm sure you have read all these things in your documents and your textbooks as well. Now, with every measurements and targets, there is an uncertainty level, right? So you need to identify what is the level of uncertainty that you are having. For example, if there is an unavailability of a data, particularly, let's say in most of the organization, like in my experience, when I'm going for an energy audit, often I do not get a historical electricity data. So that becomes that increases my uncertainty level. Why? Because when you have an electricity consumption data, let's say for a 12 months, and out of that 2 or 3 months are missing, and then if you draw a trend line on that, you will not get a clear picture on how the electricity consumption is behaving over each and every month. So you need to identify this uncertainty, and there are a lot of statistical tools that are available. And if you are in the from the statistics background, you very well know what I am talking about. Like, people are even doing the hypothetical testing, I would say. They do exploratory data analysis, EDA, to understand and reduce their uncertainty level. These are the very current upcoming topics. So, and these are very frequently used by data scientists as well, just to give you a picture. So energy, you can, if you are working in the energy sector, it can give you a different opportunity of also to work as a data analyst in a very big organization as well. Next, we come to the reporting part. So GHG reports are fairly very simple, and you can see the way you prepare your energy audit report, or I would say any CDM project design document, or for any PSF, which is called project statement report. So these are the general topics that you need to capture in your reports, which is the description of your reporting organization. Like, you just start with the brief about the project, about the organization itself, and then the person or the entity responsible for their report. Don't include your name. Always try to include the upper management or the top management name. That brings the credibility in the report as well. Of course, with their consent and the approval, only then go ahead and include their name as well. Okay. Uh, Reporting period that you are covering. So you need to be very clear that what is the period, whether you are covering a 3-year period or a 4-year period. So make it very transparent, your report. The organizational boundaries, as I told you, you need to mention clearly that whether it is a control approach method you are using, or the equity share approach method you are using. And then documentation of your reporting boundaries, including criteria for determination of the organization to define significant emissions. And then direct GHG emissions quantified separately. As I told you, not only look for CO2 emissions, look for the other emissions like methane, N2O, NF3, SF6 as a major emissions, I would say. And report it in one single unit, make it consistent, which is in tons of CO2 generally, which is a industry practice. Then yes, as I told you, this is a voluntary step. Most organizations are currently not doing it, but very good organizations, they do conduct a verifications by any third party to review their GHG emissions and reports, and based on that they issue a verification statement for that. Okay, so you can go ahead and also request your organization to do this part as well, which comes under the part 3 of the scope. So this is a summary. What I can think of, I have tried to capture like scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, just to give you in a nutshell, what are mainly and generally used. So if you are in energy generation, for example, in the sector, if you are in energy generation sector, what is energy generation sector? Maybe you are in a thermal power plant. So in your scope 1 emissions, what will be your scope 1 emissions? It is a stationary combustion like boilers, turbines used in the production of electricity. Then you have the mobile combustions like the trucks, barges, trains for the transportation of your fuels. So this transportation of the fuels doesn't means from the mines to your thermal power plant. Remember that, okay? This transportation of the fuels is means from your storage area till your process area where the boiler is, okay? And then you have the fugitive emissions like the methane leakage emissions from transmission and the storage facilities. Like, often when you are storing a coal in your coal yard, there is a chances of the fugitive emissions of methane leakage. So you need to consider that as well. Similarly, for energy generation, you have a scope 2 emissions, which are again the consumption of purchased electricity. For example, if your thermal power plant, although it is, we say that, okay, it is a captive power plant, but not always they rely 100% on the captive power plant. For contingency, they usually keep a buffer and generally purchase some of the electricity from the grid. So that becomes your scope 2 emissions. And then scope 3 emissions as well, you can see here, which are your process emissions, mobile emissions. Similarly, I have categorized here for oil and gas. You can have a look into that. And then particularly if you are working in the coal mining industries, so there also it is categorized here. Some of the other sectors I have mentioned here, like HFC 2022 production. What are your scope 1 emissions, scope 2 and scope 3? For people who are working or who will be working in semiconductor productions, they can look into that. This table, you can find it out when you just in the Google type GHG inventory reporting, and you will get a PDF of the GHG reporting standards. And then probably in the annexures or appendix, you will get a very detailed list as per the sector wise, what are the scope 1 and scope 2, scope 3 emissions. These are not complete, these are not limited to, but then they are, it acts as a good starting point for you to understand on the three scope of emissions that we are talking about. So yes, that brings to the end of my slide. If you have any questions, if you have anything, we can discuss about that as well. Just let me know if anybody has any questions on that.
Thank you so much, sir. It was indeed an informative session. Now we would like to move on towards the question and answer session. So the first question is from my side. So my question is that you talked about the scope 3 emission. Now, scope 3 emission, we all know that it is a broad category. So in that case, there have been a lot of cases like of underreporting, and like some of the companies have not reported even their scope 3 emission. So what are your comments on it? And the second part is it done purposely, or like it is done because it is a broad category, but because it includes a lot of indirect emissions?
Yeah, in my honest opinion, it is the actually mix of both. Organization deliberately don't want to report into scope 3 emissions because that would mean that there is a very high level of commitment that needs to be done from their side. And the second thing is that the unavailability of the data, because scope 3 emissions is as I told, is a indirect emissions, and to have a very good understanding of the scope 3 emissions, each and everything has to be documented on a real-time basis, which is generally not the case as on date with most of the organizations. Having said so, if you go through and look into good corporates like ITC and Tata Steel and the bigger names, I would say in Indian context and also in the European context. People are actually going in depth and trying to mention their scope 3 emission as much as possible. They generally in their disclaimer, they mention that this is not an exhaustive and the companies are still working on it to find out the scope 3, but at least something is better than nothing. So the organization have already started working on that part.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much for your answer. The second question from my side is that we have, you talked about the GHG standards and protocols. So one of them is ISO, but there are other as well. So many organizations, they might tend to use different kind of protocol and standards. So does it not bring into the question the issue of comparability at that time? Because ultimately the GHG emission, they're accounted because they are accounted for comparison and benchmarking. So does it not bring into the question the issue of comparability then?
Comparability as in?
As in, sir, for example, there are two organizations, they're using two different standards. So ultimately, basically the GHG emissions, they are accounted because in order to compare who is relatively performing better. So
Right.
in that case, doesn't make it difficult ultimately. So whenever the data comes, so doesn't make it difficult to compare which organization is performing relatively better.
See, in this webinar, we talked about ISO 1464, which is a framework, as I would say, as I told in the beginning. Based on that, the various other topics or the standards have been formed. So, as I would say, one of the derivative framework of this ISO 1464 is GRI, Global Reporting Initiative. So this is a very standard and internationally accepted framework, which most organizations use this framework to report their GHG emissions. So GRI, they follow the GRI standards based on which they account their scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. So then it becomes apple to apple comparisons for those things. But yes, you are rightly said. If the companies, if any organizations, various organizations have different, currently are adopting different approaches, so it becomes difficult for any outside person or any stakeholder, for that matter, to understand which company they should work with, and even for banks, which banks they should companies they should give the green loans with. So currently those international frameworks are being working on to have a one standardized systems, but 90% of the company, I would say, they are working on the GRI frameworks.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much for your answer. Now we'll move on to some of the few questions. Partha Chakrabarti wants to ask, why don't we use electric vehicles or any other equipment instead of greenhouse gas emission vehicles?
Why don't we use electric vehicles or any equipment instead of greenhouse gas emission vehicle or any equipment? In what context you want to say why don't we use electric vehicle in any organization? Well, Partho, the thing is, electric vehicles as on dates are not a very viable or a cheap option, right? Because of the batteries and the charging facilities. So in India, for surely, it is not the cheapest option when we are talking about the industrial or the organizational level. Individuals, responsible individuals, they are going and purchasing ahead with electric vehicles. I see here in Dubai or in GCC, most of the people, I mean, still comparatively to compared to other countries, most people are buying Tesla. But then again, the exposure or the penetration of the electric vehicles is not that much currently because of their battery and the charging disadvantages. So I believe, if I'm reading, I was reading, Tesla is working on that, and probably other automobile companies who are also working in India. So if they are coming up with any better options or anything, of course, it can be one of the good solutions. If you have worked in any manufacturing industries, for example, I have started my career in ceramics industries, in a manufacturing industries. So I have seen like the forklift or even battery operated cars be used, to transport the finished product from one place to another, instead of a typical uh, diesel based engines or diesel based vehicles. So initiatives are being taken, and it has been there in the Indian industries, but not particularly with the electric vehicles.
Thank you so much, sir. The next question is from Arindam Hazra. He asked, which is the most effective, cost-effective equipment? So is it the purchase of credit or the use of green technology?
Absolutely. I am always an ardent believer and a follower of energy efficiency. So any organization, the best and the effective way cut down your emissions is to improve your emissions levels or reduce your energy consumption. So the first and foremost effective in today's world is to first to reduce, and then whatever you are unable to reduce it, then go ahead and reduce your impact of the purchased electricity by investing in maybe solar rooftop or any sort of a solar PV. I would say solar hot air generations, hot water generations. Okay, so these are the effective ways. And then even if after that, if you have still wanted to offset the remaining emissions, then only go with the purchase of credits. Remember, the purchase of credits, it sounds very simple, but it's very market dynamics is are there. It's just like share markets. So the prices go up and down. So you need to be careful in which projects you are investing and at what price. Okay. Also, if you ask me honestly, purchasing of credits is a very easy scapegoat of your responsibility of what you or whatever the bad work that you have done in emissions and polluting the climate. Purchasing of the credits is a easy scapegoat, so don't do that. I firmly work on that principle. First reduce, and then invest and implement renewable energies, and then only go ahead and purchase with the credits.
Thank you so much for your answer, sir. It was very much clear, I think. So the next question is, in order to make a net zero economy for one sector, we need certain developed scenarios. So what should be the approach to make the scenario much more developed for a particular sector?
Now we have to develop a scenarios for net zero for one sector. So what should be our approach to develop a scenario for any particular sector? So net zero is a it's not a very easy I would say terminology. So whenever an organization says that we wanted to be a net zero by 2050, okay, there are series of approaches that has to be considered. While what will be your approach before you can claim that you are a net zero by 2050. So as you said that what should be our approach on that part. Again, the first approach is to identify what are your in which sector you are, and what is the emissions that you are having in that sector, both direct and indirect emissions. And then try to implement or investigate or work with your vendors or stakeholders on how to optimize or reduce those emissions levels. Once you have reduced those emissions levels on that part, then look for the avenues whether you can invest in any sort of a renewable energy or any alternate technologies as well, which will help you to cut down your emissions as furthermore. Once you have done that as well, then you can look forward and look into to invest in or tie up with any carbon offset programs, like working with any afforestation deforestation projects, buying some carbon credits. So these are broadly I talk categorized into three sectors. Eventually you would see the net zero. The difference between the net zero is that, again, when we say carbon neutral, we talk only about the CO2. Remember that. But net zero talks about all the greenhouse gas. So in any organization, don't only look for the CO2 only, look for all the greenhouse gas when you are particularly reporting for net zero.
Thank you so much for your answer, sir. So the last question we'll be taking up is, for GHG accounting, which should be used, GRI or GHG protocol?
GRI or GHG protocols for scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 accounting. Well, see, GRI is the most standard way of reporting that thing. So, and if you see, GRI has taken its references from GHG protocol as well. So if you look into that, if you go through the various standards of the GRI and various sector specifics of the GRI, you would see there are the references from the GHG protocol. But in our case, we generally go ahead and get our project certified on a GRI scale as well only.
Thank you so much for your answer. Now, I would like to request our Professor BKC sir to kindly deliver the vote of thanks. Uh, BKC sir, are you available?
I think there is a problem with him and his microphone at the beginning. Maybe that could be the reason.
Piyali ma'am, would you like to take this opportunity? So, if you can wait for a few minutes. Sorry for the inconvenience.
No
Yeah,
problem.
actually, I think because sir is not here. No, maybe somewhere different house. He is not able to hear. So thank you, Shobik.
Oh,
So on behalf of ISWBM and on behalf of myself, so thank you for accepting my invitation just to recall. So and taking your time from there, you have spent a lot of time to interact with our students. So in future, I think we will interact more with the students and please guide our students and your juniors that how to they can go forward. So during their projects and their internship, I will expect that you will help them in this way. So that will be great help from our alumni members. We can get it. So thank you. We can interact more in future. We have a more interaction with the students. Okay.
yeah,
So
absolutely. It was a great pleasure for me also to come back to the institute as an alumni and, seeing such wonderful people, and very good to see three of our students got nominated in AE scholarships.
hmm,
Very good to
yes.
see that. And definitely whatever is my experience and whatever the challenges I would face, I have faced, I would definitely try to guide them on that part. So you can connect with me in LinkedIn. It's all, my profile is already there. You can connect with me, drop me a message anytime, so without any hesitations. And last but not the least, focus on the subjects. Even at
Right.
times we also used to get frustrated with our subjects. So that is on a lighter note, I would say. Yes, we would also used to get frustrated, but don't give it up, because this sector has got an enormous opportunity and potential compared to the other two streams that I can boldly say as per environment and transport and logistics. People, our ex-alumni are placed across the world, and they are earning in multiple times compared to our fellow to their fellow students. So it's a very lucrative, and whenever you are getting an opportunity, try to get associated with a company, not because of its brand name. Okay, try to see where you can get the value out of your work or value out of your project. That is most important, because that
Right.
that prepares a launch pad for you to move on a higher scale. For my
Right.
experience, for my example, if I go back, when I was in my final year of passing out from ISWBM, I was having two offers. One was from a consulting, typical climate change CDM consulting firm, which is based in
Shobhik, you were muted. Somehow.
am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yes,
Now
yes.
it's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, so sorry, as I was telling my experience, when I was in my final year, I was having two offers. One was with a consulting group well within in Calcutta or in Bhubaneswar. I didn't opt for that because consulting, I believe, doesn't gives you in-depth focus, but that doesn't mean I have any negative vibes on that. Yes, you can do if it totally based on you, how you wanted to shape up your career in consulting field or in the manufacturing field. For me, I wanted to understand the crux and details of what I have studied in 2 years in energy management. Yeah, and that can only be done through slogging it out in the manufacturing industries. So I did that in the manufacturing industries. That gave me the launch pad, to go and come up with work in various other sectors. So opportunities and everything is there. That's what I said. This is my personal thing which I did. I just thought of shared this with you. So you need to think about it and study accordingly. Opportunities are there, so don't give it up, and don't think that you could have done this, it would have been better, and not this. You are just at the in a right spot, just at the right time, so make a best use of it, and all the best to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your views. So, when you come to Calcutta, you are welcome to come ISWB and interact with the students personally.
Absolutely, definitely I would
Yeah.
try that.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Participants can collect the certificate and we shall now close this session. Thank you.